So this is an old message that I preached about a year ago, just over the new year. And because it's a new year, it deals with resolutions, with people want to change their habits, want to exercise more, eat more vegetables, that sort of thing. But what it does, it tries to frame the message in a way that people are already expecting, already asking questions about how can I change? How can I, do something significant this year that would really make a difference? And I think, in a way, you still want to be faithful to the passage. That should be the main meat or content in what you're going to be saying to your audience. But on the other, it's an opportunity for you to answer that question that's already on people's minds. And so that's why, I begin with the topic of resolutions. I begin with just how hard it is to keep a resolution. But what I end with is the passage. What I end with is, the call to be faithful, to keep on preaching Christ, and to not give up, which I think is the main point of this bit in Acts chapter 17. And I think, most of the time we tend to do it the other way around. We start with the passage, we end with application. But what I'm saying is, I tend to start with the application. I tend to start with the context of, you can start with anything virtually anything that people are concerned about. And what you want to land with at the end is Jesus. What you want to land with is how the Bible actually deals with these questions in a way that is much more compelling, much more interesting, much more applicable than any sort of wisdom that you can draw out of the Bible, but more by going into the Bible and looking for these answers there. So that's what I try to do. This is just a rehearsal. I'm just reading out the text. You can read it online. But hopefully this is something that's helpful for you if you're, preparing a Bible study, preparing to give a talk. I would say, rather than end with the application, start with it. Start with the application, start with the context, and end with the passage, end with the gospel, end with the call to faithfulness and to trust and reliance on Christ. That's what I do here. A new year means a new start, a new change. Exercise more, eat more vegetables, that sort of thing. But some people are serious about their habits, and some people have seriously weird habits. Take Mark Zuckerberg, who is big on New Year's resolutions. In 2009, Mark resolved to wear a tie every day. In 2011, he resolved to only eat animals he had personally killed. Or Bill Gates. Bill Gates at business meetings likes to sit on a rocking chair. Apparently, when Bill is excited about an idea, he starts rocking that chair. Steve Jobs ate carrots for weeks until his skin turned orange. Jack Ma ate instant noodles every day for the last 18 years. Now, why do I mention this? Because everyone is looking for that secret recipe to success. Everyone wants the one thing to make them smarter, happier, fitter. But New Year's resolutions, they remind us just how hard it is, how long it takes to change even one thing, to change even one habit. Why? Because changing habits means changing ourselves, our likes, our dislikes. It's one thing to change your circumstance. It is another to change your character, your wants and desires. Three things we are looking at in today's passage from Acts chapter 17. Three habits: a good habit, a bad habit, and a weird habit. Come with me to Acts chapter 17. In verse 1. When Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. We begin with a good habit. And the question is, what makes a good habit good? Going to church. A lot of you are expecting me to say that. And yes, verse 2 says, Paul went into the synagogue. But that's not what I mean. What makes a good habit good is consistency. You know it is good, and you keep doing it because it is good. You don't give up. Verse 2, Paul goes to the synagogue and he keeps doing this for 3 Sabbath days. He keeps reasoning from the scriptures. He keeps preaching from the Old Testament. Verse 3, he tells them, this Jesus is the Messiah. Now, the fact that it only says this once means Paul keeps saying this again and again. Jesus is the Christ. He doesn't talk about one thing this week and then another thing next week. It's Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And verse 4, some of the Jews were persuaded, meaning they became Christians. But notice it wasn't just the Jews who became Christians, God-fearing Greeks, and prominent women too, or in Cantonese, tai tai. It's like preaching in the Chinese church, and yes, some Chinese people become Christians, but actually most of the new converts are English, BBC, or Indian. The synagogue was Jewish, but here were Greeks. The synagogue was primarily for men, but here were women coming to Christ. Meaning what? Paul did the same thing wherever, whenever, to whoever. He told them about Jesus. He told them to give their lives to this Jesus who died for our sins, who rose for our justification. Now, verse 2 begins, as was his custom. And if you look through the entire Bible, the entire New Testament, that phrase, as was his custom, occurs only 2 times, here in Acts and in Luke chapter 4 and verse 16, talking about Jesus. Luke 4 verse 16. Jesus went to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read. Both written by Luke, both talking about the synagogue, both talking about the Bible. I don't think that's an accident. Paul is doing exactly what Jesus did in his ministry, explaining, proving, and preaching the Bible to people who knew their Bibles. If nothing else, Luke, who wrote the Gospel and Acts, is saying to us, don't give up. Keep reading the Bible, especially as God's people. Why? Because even though we know something is good, if we keep doing it long enough, we will feel tempted to give up. You see, what makes a good habit good is consistency. You keep doing it. It's faithfulness. You don't give up. Well, that's the good habit. Next, we look at the bad one. Verse 5, Acts 17, verse 5. But other Jews were jealous, so they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. What makes a bad habit bad? Forming a mob, rioting, troublemaking, according to verse 5. But no, that's not what I mean. A bad habit is something you know is bad, but you keep doing it anyway. Your parents tell you it's bad. Your friends tell you it's bad, but you keep doing it anyway. Look down to verse 13. Verse 13, but when the Jews in Thessalonica learned that Paul was preaching the word of God at Berea, some of them went there too, agitating the crowds and stirring them up. They do it all over again, in a different place, in a different church, but the same people cause the same trouble all over again. What do you call that? An addiction. We think of addiction and we think of smoking and drinking and spending too much time on the internet, that sort of thing. And because of that, we think, I'm not so bad. I'm not causing trouble, like these Jews. But you see, verse 5 looks at the sin under the sin. Why were they causing all this trouble? Because verse 5 tells us they were jealous. The symptoms were rioting, troublemaking, but the disease was jealousy. If you think about it, that's crazy. Verse 5 doesn't say that they hated Paul, that they hated his teaching. Instead, it says they were jealous, meaning part of them loved it. Part of them said, I wish I was like Paul. I wish I could preach like Paul and win lots of people to Jesus like Paul. And if you think about that, that's crazy. Except it's not. Sin is wanting something from God without God, wanting to be God instead of God. And when I don't get what I want, I get depressed, jealous, angry, anxious. But that's not sin in itself. Those are just the symptoms. Those are just on the surface. The problem is in my heart. I want to be God instead of letting God be God. And the point is, I can try to change my habit, but only God can change my heart. The most serious sins in our lives, I'm guessing you shouldn't do it. It's bad, but you just can't help it. You keep doing it again and again and again. You can try to change your habit, but only God can change your heart. Well, so far we've seen a good habit looking at Paul. We've seen a bad habit looking at these Jews. But finally, we're going to see a weird habit, this time looking at the crowd in verse 5, Acts 17, verse 5. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decree, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus." When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. They put Jason and the others on bail and let them go. The crowds, they're just people. They're just minding their own business, doing their shopping. But what happens? Suddenly, they turn into a mob, or as we would say today, suddenly they become viral. Verse 5, they rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. And the word there is actually demos, or people, where we get the word democracy. This is the will of the people. Verse 6, the city officials get involved. These men who have caused trouble all over the world, literally they've turned the world upside down, have now come here, meaning we don't want this sort of people here in Cambridge. We don't need this sort of religion in Cambridge. Verse 7, they appeal to nationalism. They are defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king called Jesus, meaning if you love Caesar, you must hate Jesus. If you love democracy, you cannot love Jesus. It's nationalism. And verse 8, all this, it works. The crowds and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. These guys are smart, and their plan actually works. Now, why is this weird? Because no one's actually thinking about what they're doing. Everyone else is doing it, so it must be right. Everyone else likes this Instagram post, so I must like it as well. It's weird because it shouldn't work, except it does. Here in Thessalonica, there in Berea, even here in Cambridge, where a whole lot of smart people think a lot of stupid things. And if you're here and you're not a Christian, can I just ask, what are you? What do you actually think about everything you've heard the last, 13 minutes? The last 13 years of your life here in church. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And how much of that is your opinion, not just something you watched on YouTube? And what do words like truth and falsehood, right and wrong, heaven and hell, what do they mean to you? Look with me to verse 11. Now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. Is it true? Whatever Paul said to these guys in Berea about Jesus dying on the cross, rising on the third day, they received it with eagerness, yes. But they also asked themselves, is it true? And because of that, the Bible calls them noble. Noble. I would just call them mature. They're thinking like grown-ups. They're thinking for themselves. And if nothing else, That is what I hope happens here every week at the Chinese church. As we keep up this habit of opening up the scriptures, as we are honest with one another about our sinfulness, none of us are perfect, all of us have fallen short of the glory of God. No, but that each one of us will simply walk out the door each week asking this question: is it true? And that as we look for the answers, as the Bereans did, examining the scriptures, we might be able to come to that same conviction together with Paul. This Jesus, whom I'm proclaiming to you, he really, really is the Christ. Well, the title of this sermon is Turning the World Upside Down. Turning the world upside down. And I get that from verse 6. These men who've turned the whole world upside down, they've now come here. It's an accusation that's made against Paul and his friends. They're turning the world upside down. Now, if you think about your life for a moment, what would it take for you to change the world, to make a huge impact on society? How could you live your life in such a way that you could turn the world upside down? If you arranged the 3 habits we looked at today, not side by side, but if you arrange them top to bottom, the good, the bad, the weird, what you get is a kind of a pyramid. At the bottom is the crowd. Everyone's doing it. Everyone's into it. In the middle would be the Jews, these influential men pressing the right buttons, triggering the riot, starting a movement. And right on top, you have Paul, just one guy, going from city to city, telling people about Jesus. It's a pyramid. Or think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if you ask the question, what do I need to do to change the world? Almost everyone thinks the way to do that is to be like the crowd, to go viral, get as many people as possible excited about your cause. That's success. That's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You get as many people as possible liking, tweeting, and posting, and you change the world. Or some people would be like the Jews, knowing the right buttons to press, making the alliances, the compromises, the ends justifying the means. But I think very few of us would do what Paul did. One guy going from city to city, opening the Bible, saying this Jesus is the Christ. That's just so inefficient. You have to reason with people. You have to explain stuff again and again. If you ask anyone at Thessalonica, if you ask anyone at Berea, what do you think of this guy Paul? They probably say, loser. He gets kicked out of the synagogue. He gets kicked out of the city again and again. He gets his friends into trouble again and again. And yet, in God's wisdom, it's people like Paul who change the world. Even his critics agree. It's the Jews who describe Paul and his friends as turning the world upside down with their teaching and preaching. And the question is, which kind of person are you going to be like? If you're like Paul, someone who's in ministry, the lesson is clear. It's saying to you, don't give up. Don't give up. Keep preaching Christ. Keep preaching the Bible. It will be lonely. You will face opposition, but you need to keep going and keep speaking out for Christ. And if you're a Christian, the lesson is clear. Don't be ashamed of the gospel. You look at people like Jason. Jason is dragged out into the courts. Or you look at the people like the brothers. They have to arrange for Paul to escape again and again. It's tempting to think, I didn't sign up for any of this when I became a Christian. But remember what Paul said of this Christ. This Messiah must suffer and must rise from the dead. We follow a Messiah who himself was rejected, who himself suffered, who himself told us to count the cost, pick up our cross, and carry it daily. You do that, and maybe, just maybe, God could use you one day to turn this world upside down for Christ.